The Second World War was not simply born in 1939 with the invasion of Poland. It was the result of decades of wounds, choices, and ambitions. Nations scarred by the Great War searched for security, but found only fear and revenge. Leaders rose who promised strength, yet they fed on hate, desperation, and pride. What followed was the greatest catastrophe in human history, but its origins were far more complex than a single spark. To understand what really caused World War II, we must trace the shadows that grew long before the first shot was fired. The aftermath of World War I. The First World War ended in 1918, but peace did not follow. Instead, Europe staggered into a fragile order built on bitterness and mistrust. Germany, humiliated by defeat, faced a treaty that punished it beyond repair. Reparations, territorial losses, and disarmament left the nation angry and weak. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, waiting for a voice to turn it into fire. For Germans, Versailles was not just a treaty, but a symbol of betrayal. Many believed their army had not been defeated in the field, but stabbed in the back by politicians. This stab in the back myth poisoned politics and made democracy look weak. Weimar Germany struggled to rebuild trust, but instability made every election a gamble. The stage was set for extremism to thrive. Economic chaos deepened the wounds. Inflation spiraled so wildly that savings turned worthless overnight. Families watched their wealth vanish, while foreign powers demanded more reparations. The German people grew restless, questioning why they should suffer while the victors prospered. This anger did not fade, it became the soil in which dangerous ideologies would grow. The rise of dictatorships. As the world tried to heal, new powers began to emerge from crisis. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's fiery words gave hope to those drowning in despair. Across the globe, Japan's generals believed conquest was the only path to survival. Each leader offered strength, and millions embraced the vision. The Great Depression only accelerated this shift. When economies collapsed in the 1930s, democracy appeared powerless to save the hungry and unemployed. Fascism promised jobs, unity, and national revival. Communism promised equality, but fear of it drove many nations to accept authoritarianism instead. The world was choosing strongmen over compromise. By the mid-1930s, dictators controlled nations with vast armies and dangerous ambitions. Mussolini's Italy marched into Ethiopia. Hitler defied Versailles by rebuilding Germany's military. Japan invaded Manchuria and expanded deeper into China. The international system that was supposed to preserve peace was cracking under the pressure of unchecked aggression. The failure of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was meant to guarantee peace after World War I, yet, when tested, it faltered. Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 brought little more than words of condemnation. Italy's brutal conquest of Ethiopia in 1935 showed that aggression could go unpunished. The League had no army, no strength, only paper resolutions. Britain and France, exhausted from the Great War, avoided direct confrontation. Their leaders hoped that negotiation and compromise could prevent another conflict, but in practice, this meant appeasement. Aggressors learned that they could push boundaries without consequence. Every failure of the League emboldened them further. The League's weakness was not just military, but political. Nations acted in their own interest, unwilling to risk war for collective security. When Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936. No one stopped him. This failure taught him that Europe lacked the will to resist. Each step forward built his confidence, and each silence from the League made the world more dangerous. The expansion of Japan. Far from Europe, Japan was carving its empire across Asia. With limited natural resources, Japan believed survival required control of new territories. Manchuria became its first conquest, followed by deeper expansion into China. Japanese leaders saw themselves as destined to dominate Asia, creating what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The world watched, but did little. Western powers, consumed by their own economic troubles, hesitated to intervene. The League of Nations condemned Japan, but offered no real punishment. This silence gave Japan the green light to continue. Its war in China became brutal, marked by atrocities such as the Nanjing Massacre. Japan's actions were not isolated, they were tied to the global tension of the 1930s. While Europe struggled with Hitler, Asia struggled with Japanese militarism. The failure to stop Japan showed that international order was collapsing worldwide. Aggression was becoming the rule, not the exception. Hitler's early moves. Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 with a promise to restore Germany's greatness. His first steps were cautious but bold. He withdrew from the League of Nations, rebuilt the military, and tested the resolve of his neighbors. Each gamble paid off because no one dared to act. In 1936, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, directly violating Versailles. German troops marched into a zone they were forbidden to enter, and the world did nothing. Had France acted, Hitler admitted he would have withdrawn. Encouraged, Hitler expanded further. In 1938, he annexed Austria in the Anschluss, welcomed by cheering crowds. His vision of a greater Germany was becoming reality. Next, his eyes turned to Czechoslovakia, where millions of ethnic Germans lived in the Sudetenland. He demanded more, and once again, the world bent to his will. Appeasement and the Munich Agreement. The crisis over Czechoslovakia brought Europe to the brink. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, believed compromise could save peace. In 1938, he met Hitler in Munich, offering him the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further demands. Chamberlain returned home, declaring peace for our time. The Munich Agreement was celebrated by many, but it was a dangerous illusion. Czechoslovakia lost its defenses, and Hitler gained more territory without firing a shot. For Hitler, appeasement was proof that the Allies feared war more than they valued principle. The lesson was clear: demand more, and the world would give in. While Chamberlain believed he had avoided conflict, others saw the truth. Winston Churchill warned that Britain had chosen dishonor and would still face war. His words would soon prove prophetic. Munich was not peace, it was the road to war, disguised as diplomacy. The Nazi-Soviet pact. By 1939, Hitler's ambitions turned toward Poland, but he faced a problem. War with Poland might trigger Britain and France, and perhaps even the Soviet Union. To avoid this, he made a shocking move. In August 1939, Germany and the USSR signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This non-aggression pact stunned the world. Two ideological enemies, Nazis and communists, suddenly stood side by side. The agreement secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. Hitler could invade Poland without fear of Soviet resistance. Stalin gained time and territory for his empire. The pact revealed the brutal pragmatism of dictators. Ideology mattered less than power. By joining hands, Hitler and Stalin made war inevitable. Within days, the world would see the consequences of this sinister alliance: the invasion of Poland. On September 1st, 1939, German forces stormed across the Polish border. Blitzkrieg lightning war shocked the world with its speed and violence. Tanks, planes, and troops overwhelmed Poland in weeks. The world's greatest fear had become reality. War had returned to Europe. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The appeasement era was over, and the Allies could no longer ignore Hitler. Yet their declarations brought little immediate relief to Poland. German forces crushed resistance, while Soviet troops invaded from the east under the secret pact. The invasion of Poland was the final spark that ignited World War II. But behind this event stood years of failure, compromise, and ambition. The war had not begun in a single moment. That had been building for decades, the economic roots of conflict. Beyond politics and pride, economics fueled the path to war. Germany was strangled by reparations and desperate for resources. Italy sought colonies to boost its economy and feed its ambitions. Japan's hunger for oil and raw materials drove its expansion across Asia. The Great Depression magnified these pressures. Unemployment soared, trade collapsed, and people lost faith in democratic solutions. Dictators exploited this despair, arguing that conquest was the answer. Expansion became not only a dream, but a perceived necessity for survival. Economic struggle also shaped alliances. Nations looked inward, raising tariffs and isolating themselves. Cooperation crumbled, and competition grew fiercer. The world was no longer bound by trust, but by desperation, pushing nations toward conflict instead of compromise. The role of propaganda. Propaganda turned political ambition into national faith. In Germany, Hitler's regime controlled newspapers, films, and radio, spreading messages of unity, revenge, and racial superiority. Every poster and broadcast reinforced the idea that Germany was destined to rise again. In Italy, Mussolini's propaganda glorified the fascist state. He portrayed himself as the savior of a reborn empire. Japan filled its schools and media with nationalist messages, teaching citizens that conquest was honorable and resistance was shameful. Words became weapons, shaping minds as effectively as bullets. Propaganda dehumanized enemies and silenced dissent. It created loyalty not through choice, but through fear and repetition. Without propaganda, dictators might have been voices in the dark. With it, they became leaders of nations, ready to march. The failure of diplomacy. The 1930s were filled with conferences and agreements that promised peace, yet each one failed. Diplomacy was crippled by fear, self-interest, and mistrust. The world's leaders believed that giving dictators what they wanted could prevent conflict. Instead, it encouraged more aggression. Britain and France hesitated at every step. Memories of World War I haunted them, making leaders desperate to avoid another slaughter. They underestimated Hitler, believing he would stop once satisfied, but dictators were never satisfied. They thrived on weakness. Diplomacy could have stopped the war early, but it demanded courage that the world lacked. Each missed opportunity became another step toward disaster. By the time leaders realized appeasement had failed, it was too late. Colonial rivalries. The world of the 1930s was still dominated by empires. Britain and France ruled vast colonies in Africa and Asia. Germany, stripped of its colonies after World War I, demanded their return. Italy wanted to expand its empire, and Japan wanted to push Western powers out of Asia. Colonial rivalries fueled resentment and ambition. For dictators, expansion was not just about pride, but about equality with other powers. If Britain and France could dominate the globe, why couldn't Germany, Italy, or Japan? The desire for empire was a key driver of war. These rivalries also made alliances fragile. Colonies were both prizes and burdens, and their defense stretched resources thin. The global map was divided not by peace, but by competition, and in that competition, war became inevitable. The American role before the war. In the early 1930s, the United States turned inward. Scarred by the Great Depression and memories of World War I, Americans embraced isolationism. Congress passed neutrality laws, determined to stay out of Europe's problems. Yet the U.S. could not escape the coming storm. American industry and resources were vital to the global economy. While officially neutral, the U.S. became the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain and other nations with weapons and supplies. President Roosevelt understood that isolation was temporary, even if the public resisted. The U.S. was not yet at war, but its role was already shaping the conflict. Its resources would prove decisive, but in the 1930s, its reluctance to act left Europe vulnerable. Only after Pearl Harbor would America fully enter the fight. Resistance and opposition. Not everyone accepted dictatorship quietly. In Germany, underground movements risked death to oppose Hitler. In Italy, secret groups resisted fascist rule. Across Europe and Asia, individuals and organizations tried to fight back against tyranny, even when hope seemed lost. Writers, intellectuals, and political exiles warned the world about the dangers of fascism. Some leaders, like Winston Churchill, refused to bow to the tide of appeasement. Their voices were often ignored at the time, but history would prove them right. These acts of resistance, though small, mattered. They showed that not everyone was blinded by propaganda or fear. The spirit of opposition would grow stronger as the war unfolded. But even in the years before it began, courage flickered in the darkness. Hitler had expanded unchecked, alliances had crumbled, and trust in diplomacy was gone. When German troops crossed into Poland, the spark lit the fuse. What followed was 6 years of destruction unmatched in history. World War II was not caused by one decision or one man. It was the result of decades of bitterness, economic despair, failed diplomacy, and unchecked ambition. The world had learned little from the First World War, and it paid the price in the Second. The lessons of this descent into chaos are clear. Appeasement without strength invites aggression. Silence in the face of tyranny leads to disaster. And when nations choose pride over peace, the cost is paid in blood. The Second World War reshaped the globe, leaving scars that remain to this day. Its causes were many, but its lesson is one. History punishes those who refuse to learn from it. To ask what really caused World War II is not just to study the past, but to guard the future. Because war is never born in a moment. It grows from silence, compromise, and ambition until it consumes everything. And only by remembering can we hope to prevent it from happening again.